I'll ask you a broad question to begin with. Your impressions of the whole Nancy Guthrie case. We're now on day 13. What do you think about this particular case? How does it sit apart maybe from others that you've worked on?
This one sets apart for
Hmm.
a number of reasons. It sets apart because of the victimology and who she is. It sets apart because of the evidence that's evolving. Now we have somebody on video who's actually approaching and just about ready to commit a kidnapping. It's set apart because we're still not sure what the exact motive is for the crime. So those three things really set it apart, and it's getting a tremendous amount of media attention. I really don't recall in the recent past a case that has gotten this kind of attention. And I think it's a good thing because it keeps the pressure on the offender, and that's what we want.
Hmm. Yeah, because back in the day of, and I don't know if you worked Son of Sam at all, but that's 70s. But then when you get into Unabomber and Zodiac and so forth, even then we didn't have all this media. We didn't have all this technology.
We didn't. I worked Zodiac and I worked Unabomber.
Mhm.
And they had a lot of resources on both of those cases, but there was no cell phone back then. The technology was primitive compared to what we have now. I can only imagine what it would have been like if Unabomber was today. But nonetheless, we certainly had a lot of interesting offender behavior, which in both of those cases, which I think would have been exaggerated had they occurred today, especially with Zodiac, who loved the media. Um, so that's kind of reassuring in this case because right now, we're not sure we've actually heard from the offender. And in cases where the offender does interact with the media, that could certainly make it um, much, much worse. So
Mhm.
right now, despite all the media, we don't have the offender reaching out and saying, "Hey, you're never going to catch me," or "Wait to see what I do next." And so that's really a good thing.
Mhm. I've heard wildly divergent descriptions of the offender that we see on the home video home camera video when it comes to, is he sophisticated or is he amateurish? Where would you put him just based on the images that you've seen and his actions and the sequence of what he does? Where would you put him on that spectrum?
I wouldn't use actually that spectrum, and I've heard
Oh.
exactly those terms. Exactly those terms. You're so correct about that. Here's the way I analyze it. You have someone that is walking up to the porch of a victim whom he is about to kidnap. And kidnapping is one of the most violent crimes that we know of, short of murder. And yet, and seeing these offenders and interviewing them and seeing their crime, I can tell you that this is somebody that's behaving in a casual manner. This is someone who doesn't seem to be stressed out. This is someone who has taken some effort to disguise who he is. This is someone that seems to be committed to the plan. He's not, doesn't seem to be really equivocating. If he is, it's only in his head, and we can't see that. But I see somebody that may have made some mistakes with the video camera where he pulls some foliage out of the ground and he smudges it. But I'm not sure that that's even a mistake. We won't know until we get a chance to interview him on that. But I see someone that put a lot of planning into this crime. And the bottom line is, you know what? He was successful,
At least to this point, right?
at least
Yeah.
to this point.
So highly calculated, highly sociopathic.
I think from based on what I can see, I would say that there is a possibility. Notice how I equivocate a little bit. I would say there's a possibility that this person could manifest some traits of psychopathy. And so, sociopathy is the word that would we used in years ago, but people use it interchangeably. But I would say that he could manifest some traits of psychopathy, primarily because we're looking at a high risk situation where his anxiety level seems to be very low. And that's the first thing that I look for in a crime scene. Was the offender as nervous as the situation called for if you were like you and me?
Right.
You and I wouldn't commit this crime, but also if we did, we would be nervous wrecks. You really don't see that in this offender, and that's why I say, and just about ready to commit one of the most brutal crimes you can imagine, and he carries through with it. To me, that suggests that he could manifest traits of psychopathy.
He's not frantic.
He's not frantic.
Yeah. Okay. Um, the the timeline that they put out and some of the technology that's involved here. Hey, the camera was disabled. Shortly after that, though, and I guess it was the morning of February 1st, the pacemaker was somehow disabled that Nancy Guthrie has implanted in her body. What does that tell you about the familiarity of her attacker with Nancy Guthrie? Would someone typically know? Would there be overt indications somewhere on her body or somewhere in the living space that she had a pacemaker? How and what about their level of technical sophistication to be able to do that? Or could that possibly be interpreted that she died at that point?
So, all really great questions, and I'll answer them like this. When you have a low risk victim, that's somebody that lives a lifestyle that in which they don't engage in criminal behavior and they don't have criminal friends, they're considered, from a profiler's perspective, a low risk victim. They're victimized in their own home, and her home was a low risk home. It was in a nice neighborhood with neighbors around. So you've got low risk victim, you have low risk environment, and yet she was still victimized. And when I've seen that fact pattern in other cases where the offender actually came to her, that certainly suggests that she was targeted. Now, was she targeted because she was Savannah Guthrie's mother, or was she targeted because she was an 84-year-old woman who had a pacemaker and she lived alone? We have to be careful about that and be open to both possibilities. But what it does suggest is an offender that had to get some intel on this person. Once they decided that's going to be my victim, they would have gotten some intelligence, done some kind of a recon. Does that mean they went into the home a month ago? It could mean that. If that were the case, then they may have information about her use of the medical devices. If they only went to the porch and looked through the window, then they may not have that information. So you have to look at that pacemaker being detached from the phone could be accidental. It could be caused by her death. It could have been intentional. I think at this point, for me, it's too early for me to say. But going back, I think he targeted her, and I do think there's a possibility he went inside the home. And if he's the one that disabled it, that certainly would suggest um, a much higher level of technical expertise.
Sure. 13 days with no proof of life. Do you hold any hope for her still being alive?
I'm going to.
Hmm.
I'm actually going to. And having been in a lot of command centers where days go by and you don't hear anything from the offender and you don't hear anything from the victim, the one thing that motivates you is there's still that chance that this person is still alive and they need me. They need us to be able to work around the clock to be able to resolve this case. And that's the motivation, the mindset that you have to have when you work a case like this. And is it outside the realm of possibility? No, because again, I've worked cases where the person is identified and is brought home after a year of being kidnapped. So I keep that in mind. I'm hopeful.
Yeah. Um, can you think of any cases that you worked or maybe that you just are aware of, kidnapping cases where they got away with it? In other words, they got the ransom money, they were never found, and maybe they returned the victim safely, but they weren't caught.
I was trying to think of that the other day, and I can't think of one in my experience, either directly or indirectly with the FBI. I've worked kidnapping cases where the money was paid, we retrieved the victim alive. The money was starting to be exchanged, and the victim died. inadvertently. It was not intended by the kidnappers, but the abductors were arrested. So I've seen it both ways, but I can't think of one where the ransom money was paid and the abductors got away, unless, of course, you go all the way back to 1932 when we're talking about the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. And in that case, there was only one arrest. And there were probably multiple people involved in that case, and they did get away with it.
That was Bruno Hauptmann.
Yes,
Yeah. Um, right. And then that actually led to some reforms in federal law, correct? Lindbergh laws and so forth,
it
interstate transport and things like that. Yeah.
it really did. And it
Mm.
really underscored, even though it was 1932, it really underscored the importance of all of the resources that need to come into a case like this. And it was 1932. Of course, they didn't have technology, they didn't have anything like we have today. But
Mm.
these are not single agency cases. In other words, you can't just work it as the New Jersey State Police, as the Arizona or the Tucson Sheriff's Department, or even just the FBI. You have to use collective resources. The manpower on this case in particular, with Nancy's case, is enormous, and one agency can't bear the responsibility of this investigation. It has to be that collaborative effort, and we've seen that over the last 100 years.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a little bit more about the technology too. So these abductors, at least what we know about them, are demanding payment in Bitcoin. Um, how does the technology of today, you're talking about digital currency, you're talking about programs like Tor, I believe it's called, where you can disguise your IP address. I can send you an email, it'll show one IP address. I can send you another email 5 minutes later, it'll be something completely different. How does that complicate matters for investigators?
Well, it really does. And of course, right now, I know what they're looking at is that the ransom notes were written by the offender, theory one. Ransom notes were not written by the offender, theory two. So they're following both tracks, and they need to. Simultaneously, they have different teams working both tracks. And the problem with the technology right now is it requires an expertise that requires that agent, that police detective specializes in and has specialized in for years. It's not an expertise you pick up just when you walk into the command center. And that's when you see going around the country, particularly with larger departments, you will see detectives and FBI agents that spend their careers developing that technical expertise so that when it's a crisis situation, you can bring them into the command center. You can bring that police officer, that sheriff's deputy into the command center and say, this involves the Bitcoin, this involves cell towers. Got it, know it, been working it for years. So that expertise has to be cultivated over years before you can really make a difference in a case like this.
We're a long way from a dead drop with a satchel full of unmarked bills, that kind of an exchange.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Anything else you want to mention about the Guthrie case that we haven't talked about?
Um, the one thing that I would like to mention about the case is
Mhm.
that the offender or the offenders, again, we don't know if it's one person or multiple people, uh, they have to live somewhere. It's not likely they lived like the Unabomber in a cabin in Montana without neighbors and without relatives. And so people close to this offender very likely were aware of him preparing for the crime, whether that meant buying the clothing and the backpack or just spending time alone, maybe talking about it, making comments, offhanded comments about it. They would have seen the video. Now with specificity now in terms of height and weight, the clothing, they would have seen that. And they would have also been aware of what we call the post-offense behavior, where the offender is very likely preoccupied with the media coverage of the case. And if you have a kidnap victim who's alive, you have to take care of them in some way. So are they not going to work? Are they not behaving? Are they not around like they used to be? So people close to this person probably have a suspicion, and that combined with this person's personality, they're not going to go back home and just be a warm and loving person because they never were. So someone close will know this person has a violent tendency. This person is around in stressful situation, is cool, calm, and collected. This person can resort to violence at the drop of a hat. This person is predatory in a lot of ways. That's who needs to come forward because really, people close to this offender are also in danger from his personality.
Well, and the scenario that you just described about noticing something within the family or within a close social group, wasn't that the break in the Unabomber case? Wasn't it Ted Kaczynski's brother who came forward?
Yes, it was. We flew to New York, to the New York Times, and then back to Washington and requested that they put the entire manifesto, pages, on the front page. And it was a lot of space that both newspapers used and agreed to do it. It was his brother who lived down here in the area where I live that read it and said, I recognize the writing, not the style, but the content. I recognize it from years ago. I think it sounds similar to what my brother used to write about, themes that my brother used to use years ago. And he came forward, and that's how we got Ted Kaczynski's name. One person. The appeal went out to millions of people who read the Washington Post and the New York Times. One person solved that case.